The 13th of December 1939, dawn, off the coast of Uruguay, at the mouth of the River Plate. 3 British cruisers, none of them carrying anything heavier than an 8-inch gun, close in on a German ship carrying 6.11-inch guns behind armor thick enough to shrug off almost anything the British force could throw at her. On paper, this is not a battle. It is a massacre waiting to happen. Within 90 minutes, the German raider is burning, her fuel system crippled, running for cover. 4 days later, her captain scuttles her rather than fight again. This is the story of the Battle of the River Plate. The moment 3 outgunned British cruisers cornered the most dangerous commerce raider in the German Navy, and did it by refusing to fight the battle the specification sheet said they should lose. By late 1939, the Admiral Graf Spee had already sunk 9 merchant ships across the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean in barely 3 months, without losing a single sailor from any of the crews she captured, a detail her captain, Hans Langsdorff, insisted on. She was a Deutschland-class Panzerschiff, what the press on both sides called a pocket battleship, a ship built specifically to exploit a loophole. Treaty restrictions after the First World War capped German warships at 10,000 tons standard displacement. Naval architects responded by welding rather than riveting her hull to save weight, and using diesel engines instead of steam turbines, freeing enough tonnage to fit 6.11-inch guns and twin turrets, armament heavier than any cruiser afloat, onto a hull that could still outrun every battleship in the world. She could outgun anything fast enough to catch her, and outrun anything powerful enough to sink her. That was the entire design philosophy, and by December 1939, it had made her the most feared surface raider at sea. The Royal Navy formed 8 separate hunting groups, dozens of cruisers, and even aircraft carriers, to search for her across 3 oceans. Most naval officers assumed that whichever group actually found her would need overwhelming force just to survive the encounter, let alone win it. Commodore Henry Harwood commanded one of those hunting groups, Force G, built around a single heavy cruiser, HMS Exeter, and 2 light cruisers, HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles, the latter crewed substantially by New Zealanders serving in the Royal Navy. None of Harwood's 3 ships individually matched Graf Spee in firepower or armor. Exeter's 6 8-inch guns fired a 256-pound shell. Graf Spee's 1.1-inch guns fired a shell weighing close to 670 pounds, more than double the weight, from a gun with considerably longer range. Ajax and Achilles carried only 6-inch guns, firing shells barely a quarter the weight of Graf Spee's main armament from ships with armor that could be penetrated by Graf Spee's guns at almost any range the German ship chose to fight at. Naval doctrine at the time held that a force like Harwood's had no business engaging a ship like Graf Spee head-on. The specifications said, retreat, shadow, and wait for reinforcement. Harwood did the opposite, and the reason came down to something no specification sheet could measure. He had correctly worked out where his enemy was going to be. Studying the pattern of merchant shipping losses reported across the South Atlantic through November, Harwood judged that Graf Spee was most likely to appear off the River Plate estuary, a major shipping route into Argentina and Uruguay, sometime around the middle of December. It was an educated guess built on incomplete information, and he committed his entire force to it days in advance, concentrating Force G off the estuary on the morning of December 13th, purely on the strength of his own analysis. At 6:14 that morning, Graf Spee's lookout spotted the British cruisers, and still believing them to be a lightly escorted convoy worth attacking, Langsdorff closed to engage rather than turning away, the single decision that turned Harwood's gamble into a battle. If you're finding this deep dive into Royal Navy history interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. Harwood had already prepared for exactly this mismatch, with a tactic built entirely around Graf Spee's one real weakness. She could only aim her guns at one group of targets at a time. He split his 3 cruisers into 2 divisions, Exeter operating alone to the northwest, Ajax and Achilles together to the northeast, forcing Langsdorff to choose which division to engage first and accept fire from the other while he did it. Graf Spee opened fire on Exeter at a range of around 18,700 yards, beyond the effective range of Exeter's own guns at the start of the engagement. Exeter closed the distance and returned fire, but within the first 20 minutes an 1.1-inch shell struck her, disabling one of her 3 main gun turrets and damaging her bridge, wounding or killing most of the men stationed there. Captain Frederick Bell, his conning position wrecked, continued fighting the ship from the aft steering position, relaying orders by messenger chain when the ship's communications were cut. A second and third hit followed, knocking out another turret and starting fires, until Exeter was fighting on with a single gun still in action, listing, flooding, and being conned by hand-signaled compass headings passed man-to-man down the length of the ship. While Graf Spee's guns were fixed on Exeter, Ajax and Achilles closed the range hard, using their higher speed to press in and pour 6-inch fire into the German ship from a second direction. It was exactly the dilemma Harwood had built his tactic around. Langsdorff shifted fire toward the two light cruisers to drive them off, and in doing so, gave Exeter room to keep fighting, rather than being finished off outright. A shell from the British cruisers struck Graf Spee's fuel processing system, the plant that filtered and prepared her diesel fuel for use, a hit that would prove more strategically decisive than almost any other damage sustained that morning, though its full significance wasn't clear until days later. Graf Spee had also taken hits to her galley, her aircraft catapult, and had sustained crew casualties throughout the ship. Believing his own damage was more severe than it actually was, and unwilling to risk his fuel-compromised ship on the open ocean, Langsdorff broke off the engagement and made for the neutral port of Montevideo in Uruguay to carry out repairs. Exeter, no longer able to keep pace and critically damaged, was released to limp toward the Falkland Islands for repairs of her own. Ajax and Achilles, both damaged but still combat-capable, shadowed Graf Spee all the way to Montevideo's harbor approaches, refusing to let her disappear. What followed was as much a triumph of deception as of gunnery. International law gave Graf Spee only 72 hours in a neutral port before she had to leave. British diplomats and naval intelligence spent those 3 days working to convince Langsdorff that a powerful British force, including a battlecruiser and an aircraft carrier, was waiting for him outside the estuary, feeding false reports through channels they knew the German naval attaché would pick up. In reality, the only major reinforcement anywhere near the area, the battlecruiser HMS Renown, was still days away. Langsdorff had no reliable way to know that. Faced with a damaged fuel system, a crew he had already refused to risk unnecessarily throughout the entire cruise, and what he believed was an overwhelming force waiting beyond the horizon, Langsdorff made his decision. On the evening of the 17th of December 1939, he sailed Graf Spee a short distance out of Montevideo harbor, transferred his crew to a German merchant ship, and scuttled her in the shallow waters of the estuary in full view of thousands of spectators who had gathered on the shore to watch. 3 days later, in a Buenos Aires hotel room, Langsdorff took his own life, leaving a letter stating that a captain with the flag of the Third Reich did not survive the loss of his ship. The strategic effect was immediate and disproportionate to the size of the forces involved. A single successful commerce raider had tied down 8 British and French hunting groups across 3 oceans for months. Her destruction, achieved without a single German merchant raider ship being sunk in a conventional fleet action, freed all of that naval strength for other duties at a moment early in the war, when Britain could not spare ships easily. It was also the first major British naval victory of the Second World War, and it arrived at a time when morale at home badly needed exactly this kind of story. Outgunned, outranged, and by every reasonable calculation outmatched, 3 cruisers had still cornered and destroyed the most dangerous raider in the German fleet without a single ship of their own being lost. Exeter returned to Britain to a hero's welcome and extensive repairs before returning to war service, ultimately being sunk in 1942 fighting a very different and far more one-sided battle in the Java Sea. Achilles returned to New Zealand waters and continued to serve for years afterward, a source of pride for the country whose sailors had crewed her that December morning. Harwood was promoted to Rear Admiral within days of the battle, and knighted shortly after, credited not for having the stronger ship, because he never did, but for having correctly read his enemy's movements and for building a tactic that turned Graf Spee's greatest strength, her heavy armament, into a liability the moment she was forced to split her attention. The Battle of the River Plate was never a battle about who had the bigger guns. Everyone involved already knew the answer to that question before a single shot was fired. It was a battle about who understood the situation more completely, who could force an opponent into a decision that specifications alone could never have predicted. 3 British cruisers, with less firepower, less armor, and less range than the ship they were hunting still won, not by matching Graf Spee gun for gun, but by making her fight a battle she couldn't fully control. 90 minutes of gunfire off the River Plate, a crippled fuel system, a scuttled pocket battleship, and a lesson the Royal Navy would keep relearning for the rest of the war. The ship with the heaviest guns doesn't always win. The ship whose captain understands the fight